Hello, we're delighted to be with you today to talk about what you need to know about school and family transitions in the COVID world. I'm Fiona Murchie and I'm here today with Aleka Bilan, who is from SPAN. Now, Aleka, firstly, please do introduce yourselves, and I think some people who watched our awards will know very well what SPAN is all about.
Well, thank you so much, Fiona, for having me today. And just to take a little bit about myself, I'm a certified educational transitions coach. And so I help students, their parents, and their educators navigate cultural transitions around the world. I'm currently located in Central Oregon and happy to be here today. And SPAN, as you know well, is Safe Passage Across Networks. We're a not-for-profit organization that helps to build transitions care practices around the world, particularly focused on schools and organizations. And I'm currently their Director of Communications.
Thank you very much. I think we'll just mention that you lived and worked for a long time in Asia as well, so you've had a lot of experience of moving yourself and your family.
I've figured it out this year, I've lived 50% of my life outside of my passport country.
And I think that's fairly typical of a lot of our audience, so that's great. So I think what we're going to try and cover is basically sort of three areas. The first one is an update from you and SPAN on best practice in international schools and transition care, and so that we really know how things have moved on over the COVID period. And then I think as we've started a new academic year and a lot of families have moved, parents will be feeling that they need to be connected, and we know how important that is. So if you can sort of give us some tips on how families can feel really part of their new area and their school, and how they can not only survive but really thrive. And then I think the third point, as we discussed earlier when we were planning this, is that there are so many children of all ages starting school for the first time or going up to a different level. And there is a lot of anxiety out there, and parents are also finding that distressing. So again, some practical tips and shared stories would really help everybody. Okay, so let's set the scene. Why do you think it's especially important now to talk about families and school transitions during the COVID pandemic, which is by far not over and at different stages around the world?
Well, I think that you and I know, and corporate relocation offices, HR offices, relocation organizations have known for a long time the stressors that a transition can put on the employee as well as the accompanying family. And schools have always been central to that transition, and we take our role in that very carefully. And that's part of what SPAN is trying to do, is help schools really be stronger in that role. But I think what COVID did and has done is thrust every single person in the globe into that same kind of transitions turmoil. And so we're having someone who isn't impacted by global mobility at all having the same kind of emotional reactions and the same kind of support needs as those of us who have been in global mobility for decades. And so we really are seeing the increased need for social emotional support in transitions. You know, for example, parents who became teachers in lockdown and were at home learning for a long time. As you mentioned, students who now are going to attend school in person in some places and in some countries for the first time. We had country borders locked. We had families separated. We had lots and lots of transitions affecting folks who weren't used to experiencing transitions before. So I think that it has just really heightened the need for this and the need for this conversation.
Yes, and of course, this time last year when we were talking about transition care, it was largely more lockdowns in Europe and the UK and the US, and Asia, for example, were having possibly an easier time in some areas, and now we seem to have a swing the other way. So it's really very tricky for people. Then there are all those things that you always talk about so well, about saying good hellos and goodbyes. And with some countries, people will have been through several cycles of those.
Right. We're experiencing, it's like death by a thousand cuts. It's lots of mini transitions over and over again. So into and out of lockdown, are we in virtual school or not in virtual school? Are we, and very well taken the point that how do we say a clean goodbye when we need to board the plane within 24 hours and leave the country, as what happened to my family during COVID. So I'm also a parent of two children who have grown up overseas and were affected by mobility during the pandemic. So all of these conversations continue to be important as we continue to ride out the pandemic.
Right. And then perhaps we should move on to our first question, really. So why are the schools so central, do you think, to family transitions? And this, of course, is, some people will have done this move many times, but of course there are families that are totally new. And of course, as a result of the pandemic, families were thrown into moving or going home, repatriating for the first time. So over to you on that.
There's lots of things in that question, of course. Just to bring my personal perspective, I'm one of those that has had to do reentry and repatriation, and my students had to do schooling in a domestic school setting for the first time. So these vectors and these movements go in so many different directions. I think particularly in the international school setting, schools have seen themselves as the welcomers and the community for globally mobile parents and families for a very long time. And the research into how to do this best actually has been coming out more recently and sort of more fervently. So the research that we work on at SPAN that we refer to came from John Hattie, and he did a meta study of all of the possible studies that researched what would impact a student's learning. And right there at the bottom was transitions. So if we flip it over, transitions, if they are not managed well, can severely negatively impact learning. And for that reason, schools need to be at the forefront of transitions care, because learning is our business. And if we're not taking care of families, and we're not taking care of staff as well, of the teachers and their families who are moving back and forth and across the international school world, then we're really not taking care of the learning that needs to happen. So SPAN's position, and what we're trying to do in our training and our continued research, so our founder, Doug Oda, is continuing to do research in the field. What we found is if you can positively manage transitions as a school, then you're going to help everyone who is going through that move. So really it starts at the pre-entry gate before admissions, and our admissions offices are really, really key in that work. And so they do need to make sure that families are feeling welcomed, that they know what their options are. And then it continues right way through the school for when the student is arriving, their first day in a virtual classroom or on campus. So we've found that unfortunately with COVID right at the beginning, schools were scrambling to try to do the same things that they were doing in person, and making sure that families were cared for as they were leaving schools as well as arriving in schools. And it at first was a bit of a scramble, I have to be honest. But what we've seen in the months since is an incredible amount of creativity in how to do this work. And so what we're seeing in the Nest, which is our monthly online gathering for individuals that are providing transitions care in schools and in organizations. But we're also seeing in our training course that we're offering at the moment called The Laws of Transitions, we're offering training for school practitioners. And the ideas that are coming out of how schools can do this virtually have been fantastic. So schools see themselves as building community very much, and making sure that they are the center of community, even if that has to be virtually, and even if that has to be across several time zones. So we do have those families that are enrolled in a school, attending virtually the school, but from several time zones away still because of visa or border or quarantine issues.
And so give us some examples of those. I think there was something like online games nights, and then all sorts of fun things, and cooking and languaging, and all those sorts of things. And of course technology, schools have learnt, were very good anyway in a lot of cases in national schools anyway, but really upped their game on coming with new things. So just give us some. They don't have to be pretty heavyweight things, but just anything really that helps communicate, isn't that right?
I think that at first schools, of course, were focused on students. And what I'm happy to see is that they've expanded to the larger community, because they felt particularly there was so much isolation at home and so much pressure on parents to be the teachers at home. So they had to inject a lot of fun and joy into the situation. So lots of games, obviously, for the younger children, particularly, and older children, taking, the students in secondary taking the lead in creating some fun games. The technology, particularly for new families, we found lots of schools who just took even a cell phone camera around and filmed the virtual tour of the school if they hadn't had that up on their website before. So did a virtual tour of the different campuses, of the classrooms, particularly before reopening, if there were new regulations in place of the distance of the desks and where you have to stand when you line up in order to keep that socially distanced thing. But again, lots of community building with parents. So, a bake-off night, when having lots of different bake-offs, and then if it was safe to do so, then doing delivery of the different bakes to the different participants, and leaving it on their doorstep. A cooking night where a parent would do a live cooking demo, like a cooking show, and everyone else would follow along and make that same recipe. There were game show nights, bingo nights. Some parent organizations would organize a movie night, sort of a screening. In fact, we're going to talk about anxiety a little bit later, but there are a couple of documentaries about teen anxiety and the impact of social media on anxiety. So some parent organizations got licensed to virtually show that film and then had an online discussion for that. So I think everything was much more intentional. This was and included not only the students, but the adults as well. So for example, I know one school that had a standing happy hour for their staff. That was once a week, and it morphed into pub quiz night kind of thing. But they said, look, bring your cup of choice. And so for some people that was an early morning tea or coffee, and for others that was a late night nightcap. But that way they brought the staff together when the staff was separated by all of the different time zones, which happened once or twice during that pandemic time.
One of the things that we picked up are that families and parents had really appreciated the communication that they did get with schools. And there was this very strong sense of trust of what was coming out of the school. So really cementing that parent relationship is very important. And I suppose people looking for a school now, as we're starting another admission cycle, that's something that you would probably recommend, isn't it?
Absolutely. Going to the website, seeing what they're doing for their transitions, how they're welcoming people. I think the wonderful thing that the pandemic really forced not only schools, but I've seen this on the university side as well in higher education. It forced them to create a longer runway. So, it may have been that a family would do school visits or a site visit, and they'd be in location in the host country, and that's when they would first be introduced to admissions or the campus, etc. But now I'm finding that admissions officers and programming is reaching out across countries and really making sure that a family is feeling welcomed much before pre-departure, and providing lots of those kind of orientation services for that. So looking for schools that have that in place, asking those transitions questions. How will you take care of my student in this transition? What are the programs that you have in place for not only my student, but for ourselves? Because schools with robust transitions care are thinking about those questions and are able to give you ready answers.
And we did cover some admissions, really good quality admissions in our recent edition of the magazine. And I know there were various things were highlighted, but it does seem that that there are all sorts of imaginative things like clubs and ways of introducing the children themselves ahead of the move and building that sort of buddy system, even if it was remote, anything like that where the child feels connected as well. So let's perhaps now move on and talk a little bit about the mental health struggles that students and teachers and parents have experienced. And of course, some children and people will also experience grief as well. So that is another of the areas that you cover in transition care. So perhaps you could perhaps start with the coronavirus and those fears and anxieties.
I think we just have seen that a lot. We have seen that fear and uncertainty that's creeping in every day. And I sometimes think about the metaphor of, when I worked at a school and we were doing dealing with a lot of grief and loss at once upon a time, and we had an outside counseling service come and guide our faculty through that. And I'll never forget, she was talking about when we think about stress and sort of little t trauma, think about if you're holding a glass of ice water, and if you're holding it at arm's length, quite high, you can hold it for 2-3 minutes, maybe. But imagine holding it for months and months. Then your arm is going to get completely tired. You are going to drop that cup. So I think that that's what we've been asking students and families and schools to do, and school staff to do for months and months. And we just need to acknowledge that even if in countries where schools are back in person, it's not normal again. And we really need to acknowledge the fear, the uncertainty. We have young people who struggled in the isolation, but we also have young people who are really struggling with the fear of going back onto a campus and what may happen to them, what may happen to their families. So really making sure that we as parents and we as school practitioners are having these conversations with children. I think that one of the worst things that we can do is say, oh no, it's all right, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Better to acknowledge that emotion, really allow that young person to talk about the fears they may be having, because then we are really getting at the root of the issue rather than letting it get much, much larger into sort of the anxiety space. I think the other thing, as you said in the introduction, this is affecting all schools. This is not an international school. This is not a local school with English instruction issue. This is not a boarding school issue. This is all schools. And I think that some students actually, on the opposite end, really thrived under online learning conditions. So we had lots and lots of stories of teachers saying, oh, this introverted student who perhaps was a bit put off by all the noise or wasn't able to really insert themselves into the conversation, I heard and saw so much more from them when they were able to be at home in a quieter environment and really contribute to the classroom. So knowing that every single person is carrying a bit of that ice water anxiety, a bit of that fear and uncertainty with them as they're walking into the building, I think then leadership and families, we really need to be putting this at the forefront of our care. Again, going back to the Hattie study, if we're not taking care of the underlying fears, anxieties, the uncertainty, the emotional needs, then our students are not going to be able to learn the mathematics or the reading or the writing of the day unless we really are taking care of that. And I'm seeing more and more social emotional learning, which is sort of the buzzword for this type of approach in any school. I'm seeing that more and more around the world, and more time and resources granted to that kind of care around the world.
And of course, it is the time of year in lots of parts of the world, particularly in the UK, Europe, and US. It's the start of a new academic year, though not necessarily the same around the world. And that's naturally a worrying time anyway for young people, whether they're going first to school or up to a different level. So I think there's also something about take it slowly, isn't there? This would have happened anywhere, at any time, and you're not just the only one. You're not the only family. You're not the only child. And I think that in itself can help, though you often think you are the only one. And so how do you get people chatting? Do you encourage parents to chat? What's the advice here?
Well, part of it really, there's two pieces of advice. To your point, the wonderful silver lining of the pandemic is that all of us have gone through it, that it's a global humanity experience. And so understanding that we aren't the only ones, sometimes when we are the only family in mobility, particularly in repatriation, sometimes we feel that we're not seen and heard or understood. And it can feel quite isolating. But at this point, the fact that all of us are experiencing transitions, minor transitions, even on the day-to-day. For example, in my local school system, we're finding there's lots of substitute teachers because of the COVID quarantine regulations, or, whatever. We're finding lots of transitions just even in the classroom, where the home teacher or the grade level teacher isn't necessarily consistent. And so really, again, parents talking to young people, that's the first conversation. Really listening, I think, is the better verb there. Listening to young people. Even a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old can really, if you can help them name the emotion, if you can help them talk through the emotion, that's really important. Teenagers sometimes are a little bit difficult as well, but if you can catch them on the off moment. Sometimes I've found cooking a meal alongside a teenager or sitting sideways to a teenager rather than good direct eye contact like we're having at the moment can get them to open up a little bit more. If we're doing something else and then they start chatting, just making sure that your listening ears are on. I think as parents, we really try to swoop in and fix things, and understanding that this isn't necessarily just an immediate fix, but it is lots of conversations over time. And then my advice to parents would be to really actively advocate for yourself and your student with your community. So finding other parents in your same situation, either at the school or recently moved or with your corporate posting or your organizational posting. Also finding, really knocking on the door of the school and saying, this is what's happening with my child. I'm sorry to be a little bit too American and blunt. I've moved to America now, so I'm speaking in a more direct way, but sort of, this is what's happening with my child. How are you going to help them? Right. Really, we need to work together as a partnership in this.
And also, I think for the parents as well, as we were saying, if the family is settled, the child's settled, then everybody is thriving, including the employee. But building that bridge with the employers as well, and somehow getting that across, that this transition done well, and maybe some extra help is needed, or some extra patience with families. How have you got any ideas about forming links with the corporate people who are sending their families to you? Is this quite common practice, and do you think it would do more good if they understood a little more about the importance of transition?
Absolutely, because if we think of an adult, I'm thinking, for example, a school is a sponsoring organization and has brought a new staff member online and expecting them to teach right away. As you said, if their family isn't settled, and if they're not settled, if they're not feeling comfortable, then you're not getting your top dollar out of that employee. You're not getting their top their top work. And so it's not only about the family feeling settled, although that's a big part of it. It's really about the employee feeling settled as well. Is there fear or uncertainty around this move that is heightened by COVID and COVID restrictions and quarantine or obtaining the visa? And so the more the corporations know that if their employees are feeling more settled more quickly, if you're positively managing their transition, then you're going to get the full employee right away hitting the ground. And so I think that it's really important to put transitions care at the forefront, really to make sure that you're getting the best learning, the best teaching, the best work out of all members of the family that have made this move.
Great, thank you. Now, tell us a little, if you can, about this exciting Managing Transitions course that you have started up with SPAN. And again, I think that's something that possibly you'll be thinking of introducing to people outside the education world as well, because it sounds really useful. Anyway, let's hear a bit about it. Who will take it up? Is it teachers? Is it admissions people? What are your expectations as SPAN rolls this out to more people?
It's really exciting. So we have, it's a certificate course called Laws of Transitions, and it's delivered entirely online, but it's delivered in a cohort model. So we have about 27 learners going through it at the moment. I'm one of them. Actually, I'm participating in the course myself with our wonderful co-facilitators, Valerie Besancene and Jane Barron, who are my teammates in SPAN and who I believe you've had conversations with before about their research and their work and their the books that they have written and the research that they have written and they have found. So Valerie and Jane really do a deep dive into the tenets behind Doug Goda's book, Safe Passage Across Networks. Here we are. Sorry. I always keep a copy handy.
Yes,
so,
that lovely logo you have. Yeah.
Right. There's the swallow and the swallow flying home to the nest and swallows migrating and finding a home. So the course is really based on some deep tenets about transitions care and the 6 laws of transition that all of us must be keeping in mind as individuals and as practitioners in an organization. At the moment, we have mostly school personnel participating, although we have a couple of organizational personnel also participating. We have someone from CIS, from the Council of International Schools, myself, who is an educational transitions coach. In schools, we have lots of different roles who are participating. So leadership, admissions, counselors, classroom teachers. And we will have a second cohort go through beginning in February. So registration is already open and the wait list is already building. And I'm happy to see on that wait list that there are lots of organizational practitioners. So folks that are coming from nonprofit organizations or relocation companies who will be able to walk through as well to see not only what is important in transitions care, but also how they can partner and build those bridges with the schools in order to make that process a bit more smooth. And again, positively manage the transition so that learning can occur.
Well, that all sounds very exciting. And it just occurred to me as you were speaking, of course, we didn't mention native languages and how important keeping up language is and your culture and cultural awareness. And of course, third culture kids. Do you want to just finally sum up by summarizing what's been happening across those areas?
I think that, again, when we're talking about social emotional learning and we're talking about emotions like anxiety and the role that schools can play, we have to remember that sometimes our more comfortable emotional languages are our home languages or our native languages. And so in some cases, we really have to expand that care into the native language. And also looking at cross-cultural kids. So the larger umbrella that under which third culture kids really fall, you know, the traditional sort of global mobility third culture kid who's going to travel with the parents' job and then with the intention of repatriation, either for secondary boarding school or for higher education university. But we're also talking about cross-cultural kids. We're talking about multicultural families. We're talking about refugee children. We know that there's been sort of an increased migration and need for support for refugee children who are moving due to COVID, due to unrest in countries, for example, in Central Asia. So I think that this is a many-pronged issue. And I think that this conversation is just a bit of a starter course, rather, you know, that we will continue having these conversations through the months and years ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Well, certainly the course sounds very exciting, and it's good to know that anyone can get involved with that as well. So finally, do you want to think of what is a good hope for everyone? How do you see the future coming on, and what possibly is one good thing that people can hang on to or do that will make a difference, or if they hear someone who's suffering in this area?
I think the lovely thing, again, as I said, the silver lining of the pandemic is that all of us have experienced transitions to some point. Whereas before, I think that was really in the relocation and global mobility space, we were talking about transitions, but I think more and more we're seeing these conversations happening domestically in different countries and different languages and cultures. So I'm pleased that the conversation is continuing. With SPAN, our goal always, the N in SPAN is to build networks. And so we really are trying to increase the ability to build networks of schools and to make a family moving from school to school to school, country to country to country, to be a lot more of a smooth experience. And for a parent to be able to see what a target country or city might be, and for relocation specialists and for corporations to say, this is a SPAN partner school. This is a school that has gone through the training, really knows what they're talking about, and therefore will be a soft landing place for me, will really be a nest where I can land after this long migration like the swallow. So I'm very, very hopeful that this conversation, that the work of corporations and relocation specialists and the advocacy that parents are doing and the global network of work and schools is really going to get stronger and stronger.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Aleka. That's been fascinating and lots of good and practical advice for people. Thank you very much for joining us today. And of course, there are plenty of replay of the transition webinars we held last series as well. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you so much for having me. Bye-bye.
So as you will see, I have been speaking to Aleka Bilan, who's Director of Communications and Educational Transitions Coach for Safe Passage Across Network SPAN, who are also award winners for Relocate Global and Think Global People in 2021. So you can find more details here about Aleka. And please do look on our website at relocateglobal.com for the wonderful webinars we also have in the series, with all sorts of stories on how to do transition well in schools, and for parents as well, and mental health issues. So thank you very much for joining us. This has been part of our Autumn Series 2021 of webinars and videos supporting parents, corporates who are managing international families and sending them on international assignments, as well as the relocation professionals who support them so well as they change country and location in countries around the world. So please do join us again for the next videos. We have all sorts of interesting topics coming up, including webinars on and videos on inclusion and diversity, third culture kids, how to do admissions well and how to treat admissions departments as your best friend, understanding about early years education for international families, and of course, choosing the right curriculum, whether it's IB, British or American, for your child or your employees. So please do join us again and log on to relocateglobal.com for plenty of insightful editorial and informative webinars and videos.